You all know games, you all play, you play throughout your life. And so we know with the advent of video games, it's very prominent in our society what games mean, but if you really look throughout human history, play has always been with us, and if you even look at animal kingdom, we see many other species that actually do play, right? And so there are at many universities actually game programs popping up and things like those. We don't really have that, but at Stanford we have many people who are very creative, love games, but then also associated with other fields like artists, biologists like me, other people that kind of love to do these things. And we thought, like, let's bring us together, let's have a fun time of listening to great talks and discuss, and let's see over time what may develop out of it. So for this quarter, we definitely have the seminar series on Fridays, and at some later time, I will also announce we will have some game jams and other activities, and there may be much more to develop in the future, and it really depends on interest and participation. So if you are interested in contributing, being part of it, or just being here, great. Reach out to us if you want to. Okay, and so this then brings me also to announce some of the people who support this, MediaX, BioX, TWAC, a game consultant company, and the BioX Game Center, and we hope to have more support in the future. So this then brings me to today's speaker, which we are very excited about. It's Keith Devlin.
Let me begin with a definition. Mathematicians always like to begin everything with a definition. And this is an aggregate of various definitions by Katie Salen and various other people. And I just sort of refined it to what I see as a reasonable definition. A little bit more complicated than most of the ones you see. Clearly more than 140 characters. But that for me is what a video game is, or at least a game in general. Not necessarily I'm focusing on video games, but that is a game in general. And the reason, part of the reason I wanted to give the definition first of all is that could also be taken as describing what I get paid to do, because that describes mathematics. Think about it. It's rule-based, there's goals. Now the part about pursued for pleasure, not everybody has that. You know, about 98% of the kids alive pursue video games for pleasure, and a much smaller percentage do mathematics for pleasure. Though I've got my own reasons, my own hypotheses as to why that's the case. I don't think it's to do with mathematics, which is a natural evolved capacity. I think it's to do with a representation that was based on the available technology of the time, and that's what I'll be circling around to. So we're really going to be talking about how you represent and present mathematics. But given the observation that the game, and I'm going to be focusing on, but from now on game means video game. Given the fact that a game, the description of a game really fits mathematics, it should be a natural thing to map one to the other. Just take the rules and the constraints in mathematics and encapsulate them in a video game story, and then you've got a video game encapsulation of mathematics with right answers, wrong answers, exploration, backtracking, all of the stuff you do in video games, you do in mathematics. And indeed, there's certainly a lot of mathematics learning video games out there. You might like to just think of a number as to how many apps there are on the App Store that claim to be learning apps in mathematics. The answer, there's about 20,000. There's a lot of learning apps out there that say they are math learning apps. There's probably an equal number, if not bigger, on Google, but you just can't get that information. At least I don't know how to get that information from Google Play. If you look at them and you ask yourself, what's the pedagogy that almost all of these games have? It's this. It comes down to little more than animated flashcards. It's repetitive practice in symbol manipulation. Nothing wrong with that. It's very useful. I wish they'd been available when I was at elementary school and mastering that symbolic stuff. It's a very useful capacity to have. Less critical than it used to be because of technology, but still a very useful capacity to have. But that's what all of them focus on. They fall into three categories. You've heard about first-person shooters. These are the three first-person shooters. Okay, some of them are good, many of them are bad, and most of them, in my view, are just plain ugly, from a pedagogic point of view, and actually from a game perspective as well. By bad, I mean the pedagogy is really a case of taking repetitive practice in mathematics, often presented in this very symbolic representation, and matching it with the engagement driving force of a video game, which is basically broccoli and dopamine. You know, you take something that people find unpleasant, and you know, actually it's interesting, when you get older, you like broccoli. But I remember being a child thinking broccoli was one of the worst things invented, but now I love broccoli. But that's just getting older. So you take, and it's, you know, it's what Jesse Shell called chocolate-coated broccoli. You just take something that people tend not to like, and you dress it up with this sort of dopamine cycle in a video game. That's the bad. The ugly is even worse, because in the ugly ones, not only is it this rather crude pedagogy where that's got nothing to do with that except that's the incentive, but the way it's set up, the experience the player has is that this is an obstacle to that. There's the gameplay, and the gameplay stops, and you have to do something like that. So not only is that frustrating, but it sends a message that mathematics is so intrinsically uninteresting and so tedious and so nasty that it has to be dressed up in this way, and you have to be forced to do it. And I don't want any kid to come out of a classroom thinking that they're doing it because they have to do it and they don't see a purpose. And when you think about it, if it's the case that mathematics is useful in the world, what does it say if you can't make good use of it in a video game that's supposed to teach it? So to me, any video game where the mathematics is not intrinsically and evidently useful is a disservice. Because if you can't make mathematics relevant in a video game that you create, how do you expect anyone to believe that it's useful in the world? Okay, and the reason these things tend to be bad, and this is just my sort of top 10, I don't know if there's 10 or not, it's just my list of the ones that bother me the most. I mean, I could do some more, but these really summarize the things that I don't like about most of the video games out there. First of all, the game is a poor game. Many of them are. The user experience, the user interface are pretty crappy. The game action has little or no connection to the mathematics. And this is the point I made before. If mathematics is that useful, at the very least it should be useful in a game that you create to teach mathematics. They very often confuse mathematics, which is a way of thinking, understanding the world, solving problems about the world, communicating about the world. It's a linguistic structure. It allows us to say things and do things. And confusing that with its representation in terms of symbols, which I'll come back to. Relegating the mathematics as a secondary activity. If it's a mathematics learning app, mathematics learning video game, the mathematics should be front and centre. Presenting the mathematics as an obstacle to doing more enjoyable things. You have the freedom to design a video game. The very least you owe your player is to make the mathematical experience enjoyable. I mean, otherwise it's not a game. We want people to enter it because they want to enter it and have fun. And it could be frustrating fun. There's nothing wrong with frustration. There's nothing wrong with feeling desolate because your characters just got killed. I mean, these are game characters, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but it's part of the experience. Reinforcing the perception that mathematics is actually arbitrary, that it's not something that arises natural. So it's just some abstract hurdle that's put up there that's got nothing to do with the game itself. Very often they reinforce the belief that instead of being this coherent body, or moderately coherent body of ways of thinking and knowing, that it's a collection of tricks for solving problems. And reinforcing that idea that it's so intrinsically uninteresting it should be so sugar-coated. Very often there's no problem solving, it's just recall. You know, again, there's nothing wrong with mastering stuff and chunking stuff through practicing recall. I've got nothing against that. But if you're trying to get people to do mathematical learning, then in addition to having a bunch of facts at their recall, they should be putting it together through problem solving. And very often they encourage the player to answer quickly. And again, if you want to have quick recall, which is a very valuable ability, nothing wrong with that. But if that's all you're doing, then you should say that that's all you're doing and not make claims about being a good educational app, good learning app. And one of the things, another thing that always bothers me is this feeling that people have, and Joe Bowler's done lots of study here from Stanford School of Education. She's done lots of study on the negative effects on people when they develop the perception that mathematics is something that has to be done quickly. Very, very negative consequences from fostering the idea that mathematics is done at speed. I mean, mathematics is a marathon. It absolutely is not a sprint. And I say that as a former marathon runner who was terrible at sprinting. And I also say that as someone who was a very slow mathematical thinker. Okay. Then there's the good. And let me mention two that I like, and I've picked two deliberately ones. This is a fast recall thing. It's a first-person shooter for mastering the multiplicative number bonds, your multiplication tables, to a point of instant recall, fast recall. And it all is about fast action. It's a very simplistic game. I played it once for 2 hours to see what the experience was like, and I found it was still fun after 2 hours. It was also a game that I could do well at because I knew the answers instantly. You know, there are very few games where someone my age can be faster than a young child, but this was one of them. So that's probably partly why I like this one. But it was okay. And this is a much more sophisticated game developed by someone I now got to know. He was a former middle school math teacher in Taos, New Mexico. What a place to live. And he developed this video game called Co's Journey, which is a first-person adventure where you have to navigate. It's set in the American Southwest, sort of Native American law, you know, sort of typical Taos, New Mexico sort of stuff. And you're an Indian princess, and you have to sort of negotiate with your wolf that you're going with to find your lost grandfather. And you have to use trigonometry and reading the stars and navigating, mixing herbs to form potions to fix the wolf when it gets sick. And you have at your side this old manuscript that you've found, which has these recipes, which means you've got a math textbook in the context where it would be natural to have a set of recipes for doing things. Here's how you navigate by the stars, here's how you mix herbs, here's how you do the proportions and things. So you have traditional instructional pedagogy in the form of a textbook, but it's couched in a manuscript that you've discovered in order to negotiate in this world and do stuff and discover your grandfather. And it's all problem-based. You're faced with all of these sort of complex performance tasks where you have to resolve issues using a variety of techniques. So I like them for different reasons. I like the first one because it's got a very sharp focus. It's purely about instant recall of the number bonds. That's all it claims to do, and I would say in the context of what it sets out to do, does it well. This is also very good in the way in achieving what it set out to do, in that it creates this sense that you're mathematically able. You know, we want people to be, I mean, mathematics is, the facts you need to know in mathematics really could be written on the back of a postcard, because once you can think properly, the facts you can just redevelop them anytime you want. Once you've got the idea of thinking, you can recreate any of the facts when you need them. And the instant recall then only becomes useful because it saves cognitive load when you're working on a problem. But it's not really a discipline about content. It's about thinking. You know, I think to me mathematics is more like playing golf or playing chess or playing tennis or skiing. It's about not muscle memory so much as cognitive memory, where you just think in certain ways that are very efficient, and you just train your mind to think in efficient ways. And it's not about the content. You know, if you can ski well, you can probably go to anywhere in the world, any ski resort, and start to ski. You know, all of the details are different, the scenery is different, the snow's probably got a different texture, but if you can ski well, you can adapt very quickly and you can ski, and so on and so forth. And so this actually creates a sort of a mathematically capable person, because the person, when they get in the character, goes through this experience of using mathematics in a real world, in a simulated real world. So for their own reasons, I like both of them, though let's not forget the fact that both are, these are traditional pedagogies in a context, symbolic representations. Now, why is it assumed, and it is widely assumed, that mathematics is something that involves symbol manipulation? And we know that people associate mathematics with manipulating symbols, because if you go to any Hollywood movie where the director wants to establish a character as being a mathematician, the opening shot of that person, it was in Good Will Hunting and all of these movies, the opening shot will have that person writing symbols on a blackboard or a bathroom mirror or a window. I'm a good friend of the mathematician that worked on A Beautiful Mind as the consultant. He said it took them forever to find crayons that would write well on glass and show up on a camera with all of the studio lighting. It's very hard about it to find a crayon that will work on glass. Mathematicians tend not to write on glass, and we don't have the equipment to do it. Okay. But why is mathematics presented as symbols? In fact, it's as I say, people assume that mathematics is about manipulating symbols, and indeed a lot of it intrinsically is. I mean, anything from calculus onwards depends for its very definitions and beginnings on symbolic definitions. But it's a product of a technology. Symbolic algebra, by which I mean mathematics written symbolically, that is a product of the printing press in terms of presentation of mathematics and scalable mathematics. Back up a little bit. Since the beginning, mathematicians doing mathematics have always used symbols. They've developed symbolic representations. Just go back to the early Babylonian tablets, the Rhind papyrus, all of these ancient manuscripts, you'll see symbols all over the place. Doing mathematics without symbols, it's almost an impossible task because it just captures the structures in the way you want to do. So mathematics has always been symbolic. However, then there's the issue of how do you scale mathematics, how do you represent it, how do you save it, and how do you distribute it so that people at large can obtain copies of it. In the days when manuscripts had to be copied by hand, mathematicians did not use a symbolic representation in the manuscripts because they knew that those manuscripts would be copied usually by the monks in the monasteries, but the scribes who did the copying, whether they were monks or not, almost certainly would not understand mathematics. So the chances were extremely high that the symbols would be either miscopied or in many cases the scribes just missed the symbols out altogether and just gleaned the words. So the mathematicians prior to the printing press knew that if they were going to write a book, everything had to be written out in words, with the exception of the numerals. Numerals were sort of common once the numerals came into being. But with that one exception, everything was written in words. Okay. Before the printing press came along, well, when the printing press came along, that changed. Because once you've got movable type, then you can put symbols in and the symbols will be copied at source. So the printing press is what gave mathematics, as it scales up to the community at large through books and manuscripts, it's what made it symbolic. Prior to that, it was written in this form. Now the first book in algebra was actually written by Al-Khwarizmi, from whose name we get the word algorithm, because he wrote two books, one on arithmetic, one on algebra, well, and other books. And roughly in about 830 current era in Baghdad, he wrote the world's first algebra book. The word algebra coming from the Arabic term al-jabra, which is basically solving an equation, or one of the things you do to solve an equation. The original phrase is a little bit longer. It says solving an equation by restoration and confrontation in Arabic. Okay, but this is a problem translated from the Arabic, not by me, but translated from the Arabic into English. So if you were learning algebra in 9th century Baghdad, in the world's first ever algebra class, it would probably be, that would be one of the problems you would have to face. Now, if you've seen this before, you sort of know, if you know what's coming, you can parse this out and understand it. But if you've never seen it before, the chances are pretty high that you have not a clue what the problem is, let alone how to solve it. However, thanks to a printing press allowing us to represent things symbolically in a reliable way, that's how the same problem would be written today. It's a simple quadratic. And the solution is there. Let me repeat. At the time, the mathematicians would have known, it wasn't this notation, but they would have had symbolic representations. But they would never appear in a book. So when you were learning mathematics from a book, you had to learn how to parse out the sentences and do the mathematics. And develop your own notation or get taught one by the teacher. But that was the difference that the printing press made possible. You have to learn the language, but it's much more efficient once you've learned it. Okay, so mathematics changed in the way everyone encountered it with the printing press. And what we now think of as the way to represent mathematics was simply the best way available at the time, or the best way anyone came up with, given the best available technology, which was the printing press. Well, we've got a different technology now. This has some of the features of a piece of paper. It's flat, you can put symbols on it. But the symbols move, you can move the symbols, you can move the device and shake the symbols around. You can do all sorts of things with that, and it's in multicolours. You can simulate 3 dimensions very well. You can do all sorts of things in that you couldn't do on a piece of paper. So the question naturally arises, if that's, and I'm going to be talking about learning mathematics. There is absolutely no doubt, at least in my mind, that if you want to do research in mathematics or in engineering or science, you're going to end up doing tons of that. You know, to repeat a point I made earlier, without that kind of representation, calculus is really essentially impossible to develop. I mean, it just would, the sentences would be too long to parse. So, you know, I'm not saying that this is going to go away, but this is known to be problematic for learners. If we can optimize the representation for people learning mathematics, by which I mean learning how to think mathematically and solve problems, then we should do that. And given the affordances this has, that doesn't, we should try to do that. And it pains me that very few people have thought about that. So the challenge is, start with that tablet and everything you can do with it and say what would be a really good representation of parts of mathematics. Almost certainly it'll be different representations for different parts of mathematics that makes use of all those features to sort of take some of the cognitive load so the student can concentrate on the mathematics, not deciphering the representation. I mean, just think for a minute. If you did have to learn mathematics from Al-Khwarizmi's original book, you'd have a lot of problems. Even if you could do the equations, you'd have problems because you were deciphering the UI. The UI is really bad. So you would find it difficult reading the 9th century algebra text, even if it was translated to English. The mathematics would be the same, it would be an interface issue. So we are aware from our own experience that the interface can make a big difference to learning mathematics, because we can imagine how difficult it would be to do it if we didn't have it written that way. Okay, so let me go to a more specific example. Here's a piece of mathematics that is chosen to be a little bit scary to most people. It's a system, it's an open system of simultaneous linear equations, modulo 65, an odd non-prime number, subject to various constraints. You have to solve it. You have to solve it in a more efficient way, in the minimal number of steps. And if you want honour points in this exam question, you have to satisfy an additional condition. So what this is meant to be is a linear system of linear equations that encapsulates a lot of real mathematics. You know, people come out of the high schools thinking mathematical problems have unique right solutions. Well, they do in the mathematics classroom, but in the real world, that's almost never the case. You can find a solution, then you find a better one, then you find a more efficient solution, then you find a solution that satisfies extra constraints. You know, the real world problems come to us in a messy form, and applying mathematics, you have to be flexible in your thinking. And so this is meant to be a problem that's just based on basically arithmetic. It's just addition and multiplication. These are linear equations. But it's meant to be a problem that involves lots of strategic thinking. And it looks messy. Now the question is it messy because it's mathematically complicated, or is it messy because this interface isn't well suited to that problem? And the answer is, you can guess this, otherwise I wouldn't be giving this as an example. This turns out to be something that in a different representation changes from being challenging and scary to something so simple that a 4 or 5 or 6 year old child can solve it. And there are actually thousands of kids around the world of 6 and older who've solved that system of equations and more complicated ones, but they've done it using this interface. The problem is the same. Instead of saying solve the system of equations, it says collect the keys to free this little character called a was it. The word being an inquisitive person. My English accent makes it sense to say was it, was it, was it? You just go around asking questions, so that's what the character is meant to be. It's an inquisitive character. And the inquisitive characters have found their way into a castle, and they've fallen into some traps, and you have to help these cute little creatures escape from the traps. They're victims of their own inquisitiveness, and you have to help them out because we want people to be inquisitive. Instead of saying for bonus points, which is, you know, multiple choice question type language, we say for maximum game stars, use the least number of moves. And instead of saying if you want honour points for the question, we say if you want to get maximum points in the game, collect the bonus items. And here we've got 2 keys to pick up and 2 bonus items. There are some other restraints, there's some other constraints involved that you would learn as you played the game. And the point is, we made this a game because there was no reason not to. I mean, you could clearly make this into, you know, if I wanted to get funding from the federal government, from, say, the Defense Department, it would have been a different interface. You know, it would be aim the gun at this thing and make sure you miss these civilians. You know, you use the appropriate skin. You know, this was the first app that we released a year ago, and we are actually still applying for federal funding, but we're going to the DOE, Department of Education, because they will like this. But if I wanted to go to the Department of Defense, we would change the skin, but it was the same problem. You know, or we might cast it as a decryption tool. Not a bad idea, given the imitation game is out. People are sort of used to seeing decryption in terms of wheels. You know, we may, if we can't get the money from the Department of Ed, we could probably get much more money from the Department of Defense for doing the same work. Okay, that's just a more efficient representation. If you solve the problem this way, you actually are going through those steps. In fact, how did I get that? I reverse engineered the steps you used to solve it here and described every single step in symbolic language. It's the same problem, it's just the representation is very different. So the question is, and I'm going to claim, this is one instance of trying to use that technology to find an efficient learning representation analogous to using that representation for the printing press. Yeah. One's not going to replace the other, it's just that for learning, that's an awful lot better. And it's using the full functionality of the tablet as a representational medium, including for beginners, entering numbers by an analog fashion of rotating a wheel. You want to get 5 times something, you turn that wheel 5 times. So you get a built-in sort of bodily knowledge of what multiplying by 5 is, how it compares with multiplying by 3, and so forth. The moment these things have tactile resistance, we'll try and build it in, because it would be even better if we could put tactile resistance in there. But at least you've got the feeling of movement. Okay. Why is that a big deal? Okay. Because those of us who use mathematics professionally, we master these symbols, we master that notation, and we're off to the races and we do fine. Now, as it turns out, most people don't get past that step, which means that those of us who do are never missing a job. You know, we actually don't need to go and work in McDonald's because we have this symbolic representations at our fingertips, and for many decades that's been a path to a good job. It's not clear that's going to continue, which will be good news to all the people with classics degrees, who usually end up CEO of the company, but that's another issue. Because it breaks the symbol barrier. There's a thing called the symbol barrier. And this goes back to some research in the early 1990s. And this was the first dramatic study, the first publication of this study. And briefly what happened was the scholars went into the street markets, initially in Recife in Brazil, and they recorded, audio tape recorded, transactions of buying and selling things in the marketplace. And one of the things they did with the first part, which was just recording the things, they found out that people, the kids, and they actually focused on kids 8 to 14 years of age, they found out that they could do incredibly complicated mental calculations with 98% accuracy. Not using the standard algorithms that they'd learnt in the school, actually the standard algorithms they'd been taught in the school. It turns out they hadn't learnt them at all, most of them. But using algorithms they'd picked up from their parents or friends, or they'd developed themselves, left-right algorithms, a whole bunch of tricks they'd developed, some memorization. They did incredible things to do mental arithmetic to get the answer right. But when they were tested on the very same problems represented in the familiar classroom fashion, not only did they not manage to hit 98%, they didn't even come close to 50%. So what we would regard as the same problems, 98% in context with a natural representation, 37% out of context with an abstract representation. Now you have to take those figures realizing there's a bunch of things going on. It's not just the representation. This is meaningful, that's motivating, it's a real life context, it's in the emotion, in the moment. Whereas this is decontextualized and abstract. So there's a bunch of things going on. And if you take some of them out of the equation, you know, things will start to level up a bit. In fact, some of the things were taken out of the equation, and it was possible to get the numbers coming closer together. I mean, by these decreasing. But it was But if you've got the full distinction, it's absolutely dramatic. So it wasn't that people couldn't think mathematics, and this was across the board. These weren't some kids, these were all the kids. These were the aggregate results. So when in a context where the mathematics arises naturally, even quite complicated arithmetic involving subtractions and multiplications and so forth, ordinary kids picked it up, as people did in other walks of life. So it wasn't that people can't do this sort of everyday mathematics. It's that the symbolic representation gets in the way. It was a representational issue. So a representation that was the product of the printing press turned out not to be good for basically initially learning mathematics. So the fact is representations matter. And there's no stronger reminder of that than the difference to the world that followed that being replaced by that. You know, if you think about the Western world, which began in 13th century Italy, within 100 years of Italy getting hold of Indo-Arabic arithmetic at the beginning of the 13th century, we had all of that. Banking, insurance, this was sort of bubbling. This was around. But what made it happen, the catalyst that made it happen, was you had the availability of Hindu-Arabic arithmetic, which meant ordinary people could do arithmetic without having to hire someone to use an abacus board or whatever. There's a little background to found in the video. You know, the idea for this video game company came from certain threads. At the same time, so go back into the early 1980s when I was playing World of Warcraft for hours a night, which I claim was research, but it's still a lot of fun. If it had been pure research, I'd have given up at level 25, but I kept going because I'm competitive. But about the same time I was doing that, I was consulting for a video game studio in the Valley. We're looking at mathematics educational video games. But I had another thread. I was also doing research on what was to become a book about Leonardo of Pisa or Fibonacci. He was the guy whose book, Liber Abaci, made Hindu-Arabic arithmetic accessible in the Western world. It came into Italy, then moved up through Germany and France and so forth. There were other threads, but that was the main catalyst. So I was doing this research on his history. The reason being that Leonardo was a popularizer of mathematics like myself. He was very interested in writing books for the ordinary people. And so I saw him as a sort of forerunner of the things I did. I was sort of trying to follow in his giant footsteps. So I wanted to find out more about him. So I was writing this book, what eventually became The Man of Numbers, simultaneous with doing these video game developments in Silicon Valley. So I was approaching video games in the mindset of thinking about how you represent mathematics and what a big, big deal it can be if you find a more efficient representation. Hindu-Arabic arithmetic was very efficient and optimized for forming a large commercial organization. Not least because Hindu-Arabic arithmetic creates its own audit trail. And there's no way you could create a financial empire if the people doing the calculations didn't leave an audit trail. The abacus board wasn't going to work. You had no record of the calculation. So one of the keys to forming international trading empires was a way of calculating that created its own audit trail. Hindu-Arabic did that. You had to learn it, but once you did, you had all of the tools to create an empire. So we had an early internet of people sailing around the Mediterranean on boats with Hindu-Arabic arithmetic at their fingertips. But it was doing that history at the same time I was working for Silicon Valley for a video game studio, that I sort of put these things together. Actually, there was one other factor that led to this approach to video games. I was actually one of the first ever instructors in the symbolic systems program when it was started in the 80s. I was actually invited to Stanford originally in order to teach in that program way back. And it was part of that experience of coming here in the 80s, in the early days of symbolic systems, that also created this background of always asking the question, is this the most efficient representation? So there's a lot of threads went into this. Well, there's nothing worse than seeing a picture of a video game. The best thing is to play it. And I'll say now this is a free game. At least it's free now. This is a free game. Actually, I think this one will always, for various reasons, I think the main games will always be free. The best thing is to play it. The second best thing is to see somebody else play it. Okay, so that was a very early problem, very early on, where you're just learning the interface, or you're a small child. That's actually one of the things that we brought this out for middle schoolers, but we found out that lots of middle schoolers have younger siblings, and the younger siblings were playing and they were getting stuck after about the 4th puzzle. So we actually brought out another version called Was It Trouble Junior, aimed at those kids, which was, you know, actually the ramps on both games were developed by graduate students in the School of Education here. And I don't have the skill to write down a developmental ramp. I'm a mathematician, not a maths educator like that, at least not K12 Alligator. So I got graduate students in the School of Education to do the actual problem ramps for me. And so we got another group to do a problem ramp for very young kids. The goal is to free the was it. You have initially 1 drive cog, eventually you have 4 drive cogs, which means you have 4 variables you can enter numbers for, and you have targets, which are the keys. Given that there are 4 cogs to choose from, and there are up to 8, we limited the number of things that can populate a wheel to 8. So if you do the math, you'll realize that the problem space will have low numbers of trillions of paths. So trial and error is not going to work. You have to solve the problem. If you're in a search space of it's about 2.5 trillion, I think, is the maximum number of paths you can get. Trial and error is going to take you a long time, so you have to think about it. Okay. The next problem, or a couple of problems later, still only got 1 variable, but you've got to hit 3 targets. And here's how you do that. This is the tactile multiplication. You can actually solve the problem without doing that, because we wanted people to have the opportunity of getting through the game. This is game design principles. People should make progress whatever their level is. So if they want to just go through and free all the was-its, they can. If they want to optimize and start getting more points and so forth, then they have to use minimum number of moves. And so there are 2 ways you can optimize. You can get numbers of stars with numbers of moves, and you can collect bonus items. So it becomes a very complex decision tree in order to maximize your score for later puzzles. Same game, just different puzzles require different thought strategies. By the time you get up near the end of the puzzle, there were 3 levels with 75 puzzles in total. You would have something like this: 4 cogs to choose from, a bunch of keys, and a bunch of bonus items. I'll say one thing. It turns out, we designed it. You have to pick up the bonus items before the last key drops. That changes combinations into permutations, which is why you end up in the trillions, because you have to do things in a certain order. So these get to be very complex. They're complex performance tasks in education jargon. Okay, here's where that one goes. I speeded it up. Not only did I speed it up, but I had the algorithm written in front of me when I was recording that. It's sort of complicated. It's sort of, even the sort of Rubik's Cube kind of complexity. Okay, so that's the game. And we were actually solving very complex systems of equations in a different representation. We're not the only game studio that's developing games in this sort of non-symbolic, or actually it's an alternative symbolic representation. There's our game, that was our release game. Out of Norway, there's a game called Dragon Box Algebra, where you've got an equation sign in the middle and you have to balance the left and the right by taking away equal things and manipulating things. There's one of Stanford's products. This came out of the Learning Design and Technology program at Stanford, LTD program. That was Motion Math, came out a few years ago, where you use the motion sensors in an iPhone or an iPad or an Android device. You use the motion sensors in order to place numbers on the unit line, essentially. It's ordering of the numbers. It's a sort of Tetris game in some big sense. Things are falling. You have to make them land in the right place. And you do it by tactile control. This comes out of a company, a non-profit in Santa Ana, California, called Mind Research Institute. They have a game that's actually in very heavy use in the Los Angeles Unified System called Gigi. At least the character in the game is Gigi, it's a game. But they have a couple of standalone apps. One of them is called Kickbox, which is challenging, and they have another standalone app, which is fearsome. I spent many transatlantic flights working through that other puzzle. And this came out of the University of Washington in Seattle. It's a free game called Refraction. Wonderful title for a game that involves splitting laser beams and learns about fractions. And there are a few others, but these are the sort of the main players at the moment in this alternative representation. I'm going to end with one remark that I couldn't have done until about 2 months ago. And that was, people would always say, and I've been giving this talk for about 1.25 years since the game came out, September 2013, was how effective is this kind of approach? Well, we asked Stanford, School of Education, Joe Bowler and her students to do a study. And they did a 6-week study in the fall in a school nearby. And I'm just going to give the highlight results. It was a standard sort of classroom test. They had a class, 2 classes taught by the same teacher. One was used as the control, one was the treatment. The treatment involved playing Was It Trouble for 10 minutes a day. The class met 3 days a week. At the end of the 3 days of classes, Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays, at the end of the class, the treatment group played the game for 10 minutes. Without any help from the teacher, they were just given the game, they played the game for 10 minutes for 4 weeks. So 120 minutes of playing the game for the treatment group and just regular classes for the control group. Now, you know, this study will have to be repeated in different contexts because the teacher actually gave it the weaker students. This was a school where there were about 60% white students and 40% non-white students. Some wealthy people. It was a magnet school. It was a really good school. So they were all bright kids. It was a selective school. But some kids came from much more impoverished backgrounds and they were on various kinds of aid. And the treatment group was actually the weaker students. And the strong class was the control class. After just 4 weeks, we get these dramatic increases. I mean, that's just showing the increases. That's comparing one with the other. What does it show? Well, assuming that these results hold up to have been repeated, and I think there's good reason to think they will be if you think about what's going on. I'll tell you one more thing about the study in a minute because it's relevant. You know, the question is what would happen, you know, for example, if they'd played for 6 weeks, would the weaker group have even overtaken them? I mean, one shouldn't interpolate from there, but they were clearly homing in on them. Well, need to say one thing, because when I first heard the results, you know, I just thought, oh God, this is cold fusion. You know, I mean, this just doesn't happen. You don't get 20% roughly mean improvement in 4 weeks. It just doesn't happen that way, right? One of the questions, the pre and post test had 5 questions. 4 of the questions were very routine and clearly related to the questions in Was It Trouble? Integer partitions, that kind of thing. So it was pretty clear that you were in the same ballpark. There wasn't going to be a lot of transfer except from the game to paper. For those 4 questions, the improvements were not that dramatic. They were about 1 or 2%, if I remember rightly. They were there. They were certainly statistically significant, but they weren't huge. The huge difference was the 5th question, because that was a question that the kids had never seen before. They had no information, no methods to solve it, except think about it. And it was a complex performance task where they had to solve a constraint system where you had to do various things subject to, I think, 7 or 8 constraints. And you had to think about these things. And what had happened was the kids who'd played the game for just 120 minutes, their mind had already got into the way of thinking about a novel problem. So we got these big results. But the results showed up when they were faced with a novel problem, and that was exactly what we were trying to get. And it's taken me some time to come to terms with the fact that we appear to have got it. So you can get remarkable results. There's always issues of transfer. Will this transfer to a standard standard purchase multiple choice question? Almost certainly not. But you know, other people can worry about that. My concern is trying to produce mathematical thinkers. My Stanford MOOC is all about mathematical thinking, for heaven's sake. I want people who can think about mathematics and solve novel problems. And I do believe, and this is why I'm spending all this time doing this, that this kind of approach can develop that. Seat of the pants, raw intellect thinking about a novel problem. So I'm actually pretty confident that these results, I don't care if we lose 5 or 6%, I think we're going to get significant results with this kind of training. And it's a justification for what people like James Paul G and many others have been saying about the power of game-based learning. The study is going to be, actually, the graduate student who did it, her sort of progress exam, I think, is a week today, actually, or maybe a week yesterday. So this paper will be, actually, this paper should be finished any day now because her qualifying exam is in about a week's time. So this is going to be part of a PhD dissertation. If you're interested in any more, you can download the game for free at wasittrouble.com. The company is called BrainQuake, and we're BrainQuaking on Twitter. That's it.